You wake up, you go to work, you earn a salary. The government takes income tax, payroll tax, sales tax. You see those deductions, you feel them. But there's another tax you're paying that never appears on a pay stub, never gets debated in Congress, and never shows up in your bank statement. It's invisible, it's constant, and it's devastating. This is the inflation tax. And unlike every other tax, you cannot avoid it, cannot deduct it, cannot vote it away. It simply takes from you, silently, year after year, transferring wealth from your pocket to those who control the printing press. Most people think inflation is just rising prices. Milk costs more, gas costs more, rent costs more. That's annoying, but it feels like a natural part of economics, supply and demand, market forces. But that's the lie. Inflation is not natural. It is policy. It is a deliberate choice made by governments and central banks to devalue currency, to reduce the burden of debt, and to transfer wealth from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset holders, from the powerless to the powerful. And the genius of the inflation tax is that most people never realize they're paying it. Here's how it works. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it has two options. It can borrow, issuing bonds that must eventually be repaid with interest, or it can print money, creating new currency to cover the gap. Printing sounds easier. No loans to repay, no interest to service. Just create the money and spend it. But printing money does not create wealth. It dilutes the value of every dollar, euro, or yen already in circulation. Your savings, your salary, your pension, all of it loses purchasing power. That loss is the inflation tax. It is not collected by the IRS. It is collected by reality. Let's go back to ancient Rome to see the first clear example of this mechanism in action. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was fracturing. Invasions on the northern and eastern borders required constant military spending. Soldiers demanded higher pay. The imperial court consumed vast resources, and tax revenue was falling because the economy was weakening. Emperors faced a choice: raise taxes openly, which would trigger revolts, or debase the currency, which would generate revenue invisibly. They chose debasement. The silver denarius, once nearly pure, was gradually diluted with cheaper metals. By the reign of Gallienus in the mid-3rd century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was effectively bronze with a silver coating. The government could mint far more coins from the same amount of precious metal, giving it more currency to spend. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. Merchants were not stupid. They noticed the coins were lighter, less pure. They raised prices to compensate. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 denarius now cost 5, then 10, then 50. Soldiers discovered their wages bought less each year. Workers saw their savings evaporate. The inflation tax destroyed the purchasing power of ordinary Romans while the state continued to spend. And because most people did not understand monetary mechanics, they blamed merchants for greed, foreign invaders for instability, anyone but the government that was systematically robbing them. The Roman inflation tax was brutal but visible. You could weigh a coin and see it had been debased. Modern inflation is far more sophisticated. The coins look the same. The bills look the same. The numbers in your bank account stay the same. But the purchasing power drains away invisibly. And that makes it far more dangerous because people do not recognize they are being taxed until years later when they realize their savings by half of what they used to. Let's jump to Weimar Germany to see what happens when the inflation tax spirals out of control. After World War I, Germany faced crushing war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The government owed vast sums in gold to France, Britain, and other allied powers. But Germany's economy was devastated. Industrial production had collapsed. Tax revenue was insufficient. The government could not pay the reparations through taxation alone, so it turned to the printing press. At first, the inflation was moderate. Prices rose, but not catastrophically. The government could meet its obligations. Workers demanded higher wages to keep up, and they got them. For a brief moment, it seemed manageable. But printing money to cover reparations meant the money supply was growing far faster than economic output, or currency chasing the same amount of goods. The classic recipe for inflation. By 1923, the situation had become a nightmare. The German mark, which had traded at 4 to the US dollar before the war, collapsed to 4 trillion to the dollar by November 1923. A single loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Workers were paid twice a day because by evening their morning wages were worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because the currency was so debased it took absurd volumes to buy anything. Savings were annihilated. Pensions became worthless. The middle class, which had spent generations building wealth, was wiped out in months. Who benefited? Debtors. Anyone who owed money saw their debts inflated away to nothing. A mortgage that had been a lifetime burden became payable with pocket change. The wealthy, who held real assets like land, factories, and foreign currency, emerged stronger. They could buy distressed properties, businesses, and goods from desperate sellers for fractions of their real value. The inflation tax destroyed the middle class and concentrated wealth at the top. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in Germany German history, and it was accomplished without a single vote, without a single law, just the printing press. Weimar hyperinflation is often dismissed as an extreme case, a historical anomaly that could never happen in a modern developed economy. But the mechanics are identical to what happens in every inflation, just at a different speed. The government prints money, prices rise, savers lose, asset holders win. The only difference is the rate. Hyperinflation is obvious, modern inflation is invisible, but both are the same tax, just collected at different speeds. Let's move to the 1970s in the United States to see how the inflation tax works in a supposedly stable economy. After decades of deficit spending on the Vietnam War and President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, the U.S. government was deeply in debt. In 1971, President Richard Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold, making the dollar a pure fiat currency backed by nothing but government promise. With the gold anchor gone, there was no constraint on money creation. The Federal Reserve began printing. Inflation soared. By the late 1970s, consumer prices were rising at double-digit annual rates. A gallon of gas that cost 30 cents in 1970 cost over $1 by 1980. Housing, food, healthcare, all of it became vastly more expensive. Workers demanded higher wages, but wages never kept pace with prices. Real incomes, adjusted for inflation, stagnated or fell. The middle class was being hollowed out by a tax they did not understand. Meanwhile, the federal government benefited enormously. The national debt, which had been accumulated over decades, was now being repaid in dollars worth far less than the dollars that had been borrowed. Inflation reduced the real burden of the debt without the government paying a cent. It was a bailout funded not by taxpayers, by the purchasing power of every American's salary, savings, and pension. The 1970s inflation was eventually tamed by Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker. Raised interest rates so high that the economy plunged into recession. Unemployment spiked, businesses failed, but inflation was crushed. The cure was painful, but it worked. Or did it? Because the structural incentive remained. The government still spent more than it collected. The debt still grew. The printing press was still there, ready to be used again the next time politicians needed an invisible way to fund their promises. And it has been used. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve launched quantitative easing, creating trillions of dollars to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. After the COVID pandemic, even more trillions were printed. The official inflation numbers claim this has been relatively mild, a few percent per year. But anyone buying groceries, paying rent, or trying to afford healthcare knows the official numbers are fiction. Real inflation, the inflation that matters to ordinary people, has been far higher. Here's the trick. Governments manipulate inflation statistics to downplay the inflation tax. They adjust for quality improvements, substitute cheaper goods into the basket, and exclude volatile items like food and energy, the very things people spend most of their money on. By these adjusted measures, inflation looks modest. But measured honestly, by comparing the cost of maintaining the same standard of living over time, the inflation tax has been devastating. Consider housing. In 1970, the median home price in the United States was around $23,000. Today, it is over $400,000. That is not because houses got 17 times better. It is because the currency lost value. Your parents or grandparents could buy a home on a single working class income. Today, even dual income households struggle. That is the inflation tax in action. It did not raise income taxes. It did not impose new levies. It simply made the currency worth less. And suddenly, the same standard of living required far more money. Or consider education. In 1980, a year of college tuition at a public university cost around $800. Today, it costs over $10,000. That is a 12-fold increase in 40 years. Did the quality of education improve 12-fold? Of course not. The currency was debased. Students unable to pay out of pocket took on crushing debt. Debt that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. Debt that will follow them for decades. The inflation tax turned higher education, once affordable, into a lifetime financial burden. This is what the inflation tax does. It does not hit you all at once. It erodes slowly year after year, making everything harder, everything more expensive, everything more out of reach. And because it happens gradually, people blame other factors. Greedy landlords, greedy colleges, greedy corporations. But the real culprit is the debasement of the currency, and the real beneficiary is the government that prints it. Who profits from the inflation tax? Not workers whose wages rise slower than prices, not savers whose bank accounts lose purchasing power, not retirees whose pensions are fixed in nominal terms. The winners are debtors, especially the biggest debtor of all, the government. Inflation reduces the real value of debt. $1 trillion borrowed today can be repaid in dollars worth far less tomorrow. It is the ultimate form of default without officially defaulting. The second group that profits is asset holders, people who own stocks, real estate, commodities, anything real. real. When the currency is debased, the nominal value of these assets rises, not because they became more productive, but because the currency became less valuable. The rich get richer not through effort, but through inflation. The inflation tax is regressive. It punishes the poor and rewards the wealthy. It does so invisibly, which is why it persists. There is a reason why income inequality has exploded in the decades since the dollar was detached from gold. It is not just globalization or technology, it is inflation. Central banks print money which flows first to financial markets, inflating asset prices. By the time that money reaches the broader economy, prices have already risen. Workers see higher costs before they see higher wages. Savers see their purchasing power decline. Meanwhile, those who own assets see their wealth multiply. The system is designed to transfer wealth upward. It works. So what can you do? The first step is recognizing that you are paying this tax, that your salary, your savings, your future purchasing power are being quietly confiscated. The second step is understanding that cash is not a store of value. Holding cash long-term is financial suicide in an inflationary system. The third step is moving into assets that cannot be debased. Real estate, productive businesses, commodities, skills that retain value regardless of currency fluctuations. These are the hedges against the inflation tax. But the deeper lesson is political. The inflation tax exists because governments prefer it to honest taxation. They prefer it because it is invisible, because voters do not see it, because it allows them to spend without accountability. As long as central banks can print money, the inflation tax will continue. And as long as voters do not understand what is being done to them, politicians will never stop doing it. Here's the final truth. Inflation is not a bug of the financial system. It is a feature. It is how governments fund themselves when they cannot or will not tax honestly. It is how debts are quietly erased. It is how wealth is transferred from the many to the few. And it is how empires die, not in sudden collapse, but in slow decay, as the currency that built them is gradually destroyed. Rome debased its coins until the empire fractured. Weimar printed until the middle class was annihilated. America has been inflating for decades, and the consequences are all around you. Unaffordable housing, crushing student debt, stagnant wages, these are not accidents. They're the symptoms of a currency being systematically devalued. The inflation tax is real. It is devastating, as it is being paid by you every single day. The question is whether you will keep paying it blindly, or whether you will protect yourself before it takes everything you have.